Talking today to historian Richard Rathbone. Richard, it's obviously a complex question, but what were the different and contradictory motivations for imperialism?
Depends when you date imperialism from. If you take early empires, the motivation was, as it always had been from time immemorial, plunder, basically. But by the time we get to the 19th century, I think we can see other kinds of motivation. In the case of Britain, clearly it was an expansion of an empire, but it was also an attempt to make sure that other people didn't home in on markets they'd already opened up. And I think that elbowing out of opposition is a very significant feature of imperialism in the 19th century. There's also the issue that you find very strongly, for example, with German imperialism in the 19th century, of wishing to, as it were, make a mark on the world of a newly founded state. Obviously it was not a state towards the end of the 19th century, wishing to make its mark on the world, and most specifically the Italian example of desiring desperately, particularly under Mussolini, the notion that it was a recreation of the ancient Rome and it had imperial possessions all over the darn place. There's also a strange way of recuperating from past disasters. French imperialism, which is very active at the end of the 19th century, has obviously a very strong feedback into the great disaster of 1870, the defeat at the hands of the Prussians, the loss of glory following, of course, the defeat in 1815, that feeling of shrunken power, shrunken glory, being recaptured again in strange places like the deserts of West Africa and North Africa. And of course you find this emblazoned all over the French metro map and emblazoned all over the names on memorials throughout France.
Was global imperialism as inevitable as it appears in retrospect?
That's a very difficult question to answer, I think, because the inevitability is something historians always run away from for pretty obvious reasons. But it's very unlikely that any great power would not wish to extend its tentacles of control, its tentacles of merchandising further afield than its own home base. And nowhere is that more marked, obviously, than Great Britain, which is a tiny little set of islands, an insufficient market for its product. And of course there's a relationship between possession of external territories and its success in the Industrial Revolution and its aftermath. I think you can see this particularly in the case of India. The possession of India marked, of course, a huge expansion of the British market, just as things produced in India produced a very large import base for Britain, and all, of course, within, basically, in quotes, the sterling area.
Was imperialism a profit-making enterprise in any conventional sense?
That's a very difficult question to answer. There wasn't a direct feedback into the treasuries of Paris or London or Lisbon. But the profits in terms of Africa are very difficult things to work out. There certainly was a great deal of profit into private pockets out of enterprise in South Africa, the only part of Africa, of course, which undergoes an industrial revolution. And the net gainers in that quite clearly are British capitalists, but also German capitalists and American capitalists, who you can see very, very powerfully in the expansion both of the railway system and in particular in terms of mining both diamonds and gold.
What about the Belgian king in the Congo?
The Belgian king in the Congo's disastrous attempt at a private estate in which he sought profit is an example really of the contrary position, that in fact Africa was expected to yield great profits, but in fact tended not to do so. And the great wickedness, and it really is the appropriate word, it's appropriately judgmental about the absolute cruelty of King Leopold's personal rule in the Congo, that having failed to make any profit out of the Congo, sought to make profit by basically getting blood out of a stone, and literally blood out of a stone, that basically seeking to get both ivory and rubber, forcing quotas upon African populations, which could not be met simply because there weren't enough elephants, and there weren't enough rubber trees, and there wasn't an infrastructure and so on, started punishing Africans for not producing these things. And the punishments were dire, and there are plenty of photographic records, as much as anything else, of terrible corporal punishment, the chopping off of limbs, group punishments to villages and so on for malfunctioning, and it becomes a great cause célèbre in the first decade of the 20th century.
This leads on very naturally to what were the key differences between the different imperialisms, because they weren't all the same, were they? They all came from different places.
I think this is insufficiently grounded in much of the literature. We generalise about imperialism and colonialism as though they were the same, and they're very different from one another. The underlying sentiments are very, very profoundly different, and they're different because of the different nature of metropolitan regimes. In the case of France, for example, one finds a culture that expands militarily, and I think we often forget that martial rule was the order of the day in French Africa really until the 20th century. For example, much of West Africa was ruled by the maritime ministry in Paris. But it's a culture that is obviously very urban, and I think that's part of the French tradition, and a culture that is very much to do with ultimately citizenship, which is something that grows out of 1789 and its ending. And it had a sense of its own mission, a mission that would enable it to acculturate Africans on a very, very limited basis over time and turn them into black Frenchmen. The British view is, I think, split by the fact, and it's also true of the French to some extent, that the fact that there are colonies in Africa which have no settlers and colonies which have settlers. The colonies in Africa which have settlers, Kenya, the Rhodesias, but most, and by not by contrast, but by similarity, North Africa, and particularly Algeria, bear striking similarities to one another. Where you get settlers, it seems to me that you always get harsh taxation regimes, the impoverishment of people in order to make them into cheap labour, and the denial of civil rights to them so that they can't represent themselves. And of course the lack of extension of things like education systems in settler territories. You keep Africans as labour fundamentally. In the non-settler territories, their contrasts between France and Britain become very much more apparent, I think, where it's very urban oriented. The French construct their territories in France very much along the lines of the French department system. Towns have mayors, the departments have in effect intendants in the old Napoleonic fashion, and so on. But the school system is entirely modelled on that of France, of metropolitan France. There are very few secondary schools, but the very few secondary schools there are have the same syllabus as French schools. And the tiny number of little boys and little girls who go through the secondary school system end up with the same qualifications as those in France. And if everything plays out right, become in effect French citizens. And we have, by the period of the First World War, French-speaking Africans in the French Assembly in Paris. Whereas the British example is one of complete difference, that you can never, in that assumption, turn Africans into black Englishmen. They remain Africans. And there's an overweening respect for traditional authority. The British seek to rule with chiefs, and rather than deposing them, which was the French tendency. Chiefs are incorporated into the system of colonial rule and become agents of colonial rule. And the whole notion is that Africans have their own ways of doing things, and the British have their own ways of doing things. Underlying this, of course, in both the French and the British case, is, of course, a real thumping case of racism as well. But the implications are that Africa will go its own way in this respect. In the French example, that Africa will eventually become like France, so that there will be more departments of France in Africa, as in Algeria, as in parts of the Caribbean. So there's a very big contrast in terms of how the system works, and it is predicated, I think, on very different views of Africans, but very different views of civil society as well, very different ideas about what should be and what should not be. Of course, the other big contrast is that the French, after 1903 in particular, 1903 and 1905, are an avowedly and outwardly secular society, and are much less permissive about the use of missionaries, or the allowing of missionaries to be active. And consequently, much secondary education, for example, in British West Africa, is conducted by missions and then by African converts to a variety Christian confessions. In the French case, the secondary schools are state secondary schools governed by the state and are secular. So that's a big contrast.
And how does Portuguese imperialism contrast with these two other powers?
I think Portuguese imperialism, Portuguese colonialism has often been assumed to be a very primitive kind of colonialism. Not that colonialism is ever very sophisticated, but it's primitive in that it is the conquest states, the three clusters of states under Portuguese colonial rule. They have settlers, particularly in the case of Mozambique. They have a mestizo population, a mixed population, who constitute something of a local elite. The Portuguese speaking there are latifundia. In the case of Mozambique, there are extensive farming estates, settler states. But they are fundamentally still, to a certain extent, plunder states in which surplus is extracted by a settler population, as it was in Southern America in the 16th and 17th century. And there's not much change in that respect. The Portuguese elite, as I say, the Portuguese-speaking elite in both Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau are basically a mestizo elite, a mixed race elite, Portuguese-speaking, and to all intents and purposes, so far as the Portuguese state is concerned, deracinated, and that's in the Portuguese state's view to be desired. And there is, of course, after the arrival of fascism in Portugal, an extremely authoritarian state in terms of their extraction, very militarised, very heavily patrolled. There's no question of civil rights, but of course there's not very much civil right available in Portugal itself, so it mirrors that. It's a very much more thuggish kind of imperialism, I think.